The morning after the hurricane, the world was a different place. The sky was a bruised gray, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and splintered wood, and the streets of Willow Bend were littered with the wreckage of what had once been a picture-perfect neighborhood. The proud oaks that lined the main avenue lay toppled, their roots exposed to the sky, and windows were shattered, fences were ripped down, and roofs were peeled back like tin lids. But in the midst of all this ruin, one house stood untouched, a 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a white porch, its lawn still green, its windows unbroken, its flag still fluttering on the pole by the door. Elijah Brooks, a quiet man who had moved to Willow Bend 5 years earlier on the promise of community and peace, had made it his home. Elijah had always kept to himself, tending his garden, waving politely to neighbors, and working long hours as an engineer at the nearby plant. He was known for his meticulous care of his property, for the solar panels he'd installed on his roof, for the rain barrels that lined his backyard, and for the reinforced storm shutters he designed and built himself. Some neighbors admired his ingenuity. Others whispered that he was a bit much, but no one could deny that his house was the only one on the block that had survived the storm without a scratch. Elijah stepped onto his porch and with a heavy heart took in the devastation as the sun rose. He saw families picking through the wreckage of their homes, children crying over lost toys, and neighbors embracing the street, grateful to be alive. He helped in any way he could, lending tools, giving water to those in need, and inviting them to rest in his cool, dry living room. It appeared for a brief moment that the disaster had united the community, that the storm had washed away any previous divisions, and that all that was left was a shared effort of recovery. But as the days passed and the shock wore off, something darker began to take root. Whispers started, first in the ruined cul-de-sacs, then in the emergency meetings held in the gutted clubhouse, and finally in the emails and group chats that buzzed with rumor and resentment. Why had Elijah's house survived when so many others had not? Was it luck or another factor? Some claimed it was his engineering skills, while others mumbled about unfair advantages. And some, inspired by their grief and anger, began to suggest that Elijah had in some way caused the devastation, and that his preparations had diverted the storm's rage toward their homes. The whispers grew louder when the HOA president, Margaret Whitfield, called an emergency meeting. Sharp-tongued, impeccably dressed, and fiercely protective of the neighborhood's image, Margaret was herself a force of nature. Her voice was heard over the rumble of portable generators as she spoke from the front of the impromptu meeting. "We are all in this together," she began, "but we must also ask hard questions. When the rest of us lost everything, why did one house survive?" She turned to Elijah, her gaze icy. "Mr. Brooks, could you please elaborate?" Elijah stood, his hands steady but his voice tight. "I did what I could prepare. I reinforced my house. I followed every code, and I tried to help my neighbors do the same. I'm sorry for your losses, but I didn't cause this storm." Margaret, however, was unmoved. "Some of us believe that your modifications altered the course of the wind and water, that your house acted as a barrier, and that this made the situation even worse for the rest of us. After consulting with specialists, we believe that you are accountable for the damages." The room erupted in screams and accusations, with some neighbors seeking clarification and others defending Elijah, but the mood had changed. The HOA board, desperate for someone to blame, voted to file a claim against Elijah for $10 million, the estimated cost of rebuilding the neighborhood. Elijah found himself at the center of a storm that was stronger than any hurricane as the news spread like wildfire through local and then national media. He was accused of engineering the disaster, of profiting from tragedy, of endangering the community. Photographs were taken, insults were hurled, and threatening notes were left in his mailbox by strangers as they drove by his house. Once characterized by quiet routine, Elijah's life was now a battlefield, but he refused to be cowed. He hired a lawyer, gathered his records, and prepared to fight, not just for his home, but for the truth. Elijah wondered how a community could change so quickly, how fear and enmity could turn survival into a crime, and whether he would ever feel home in Willow Bend again as the legal battle got underway. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through Willow Bend, dividing the neighborhood into camps, those who believed Elijah was a scapegoat for their own misfortune, and those who, driven by desperation and the need for restitution, clung to the idea that someone had to pay for what the hurricane had done. The HOA's legal team, emboldened by Margaret's relentless drive, began to build their case with a mix of pseudoscience and emotional appeals, arguing that Elijah's reinforced home had redirected destructive forces and created a wind tunnel effect that devastated the surrounding properties. They cited diagrams, weather models, and even the testimony of a self-proclaimed storm dynamics expert who had never set foot in Willow Bend. Depending on the headlines of the day, the media seized on the story and depicted Elijah as either a villainous mastermind or a symbol of resilience. News vans camped outside his house, reporters clamoring for interviews, while online forums exploded with speculation, conspiracy theories, and in some corners, outright racism. Elijah received calls from distant relatives, old friends, and strangers who saw in his struggle a reflection of their own fears and hopes, and his inbox was overflowing with messages of hate and support. Through it all, Elijah remained calm, methodical, and determined. He worked closely with his attorney, a sharp-witted woman named Carla Jenkins, who saw through the HOA's bluster and focused on facts. They gathered evidence together, including weather data, engineering reports, building permits, and expert testimony from real structural engineers and meteorologists. They demonstrated that Elijah's modifications were not only permitted but also supported by state and federal regulations. They also demonstrated that Elijah's house had not altered the storm's path and that the real problem was a combination of poor construction, out-of-date regulations, and nature's sheer erratic power. Carla was relentless in her cross-examinations, exposing the HOA's expert as a fraud and dismantling the board's arguments piece by piece. But the battle was not just fought in the courtroom. Tensions boiled over in the area. Shameful residents began to contact Elijah, offering their apologies and seeking guidance on how to rebuild stronger. Others doubled down, convinced that their suffering demanded a scapegoat. Margaret stepped up her rhetoric, stating that Willow Bend would never recover if Elijah was not held accountable, sensing that she was losing control of the community. She organized rallies, circulated petitions, and even appeared on national television, her voice trembling with righteous indignation as she declared, "We cannot allow one man's selfishness to destroy our community." Elijah watched these developments with a mix of sadness and resolve. He was aware that the real conflict was not just over money or who was to blame, but also about Willow Bend's soul, and whether or not fear and enmity would prevail over reason and compassion. He continued to open his home to those in need, to volunteer at the local shelter, and to speak calmly and honestly whenever given the chance. He refused to be defined by the accusations, to let anger or bitterness take root. The pressure grew as the trial date got closer. The HOA's lawyers filed motion after motion, seeking to delay the proceedings, to bury Elijah in paperwork, to wear him down. But Carla was unflappable, countering every move with precision and poise. The judge, a fair but strict woman who had little patience for showmanship, made it clear that the case would be decided based on facts and not on speculation or fear. The community watched, divided and anxious, as the day of reckoning drew near. Elijah spent sleepless nights reviewing documents, preparing statements, and wondering what more he could have done to prevent this nightmare. He thought of his parents, who had taught him to stand up for what was right, of the friends he had made and lost, of the future he still hoped to build. He was aware that he would never be the same again, and neither would Willow Bend. Regardless of the outcome, the day of the trial dawned with a heavy, humid stillness, as if the very air in Willow Bend was bracing for another storm. The courthouse was packed. Neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers filled every seat, their faces a mosaic of anxiety, resentment, and hope. Elijah arrived early, dressed in a simple suit, his posture calm, but his eyes betraying the exhaustion of months spent under siege. His attorney, Carla Jenkins, gave him a reassuring nod, her briefcase full of evidence and her mind as sharp as ever. Across the aisle, Margaret Whitfield sat with the HOA's legal team, her expression a mask of righteous certainty. Her supporters clustered around her like a protective shield. The judge entered, her gavel striking the bench with a finality that silenced the room. The HOA lawyer portrayed Elijah as a reckless tinkerer whose selfish modifications had ruined his neighbors, but Carla countered with a clear and measured account of Elijah's compliance with all regulations and his efforts to help others prepare. These opening statements set the tone. Engineers, meteorologists, neighbors who had seen Elijah working late into the night before the storm, and even a few who admitted that they had ignored his request for assistance were all called in as witnesses. Carla pressed the expert of the HOA, but he faltered, unable to provide any real-world examples of a single house causing widespread destruction or to explain the fundamentals of wind dynamics. Carla's own experts, by contrast, presented clear, compelling evidence. Diagrams showing the storm's path, data proving that Elijah's house had simply withstood the hurricane because it was built to higher standards, and testimony that the real problem was the neighborhood's outdated construction and the board's failure to enforce modern codes. The turning point came when Carla introduced a series of emails, messages Elijah had sent to the HOA months before the storm, urging them to update their guidelines, offering to lead workshops on storm preparation, and even volunteering to help inspect homes for vulnerabilities. In hindsight, the emails were painfully prophetic despite being polite and detailed. In one instance, the board's responses were abrupt, dismissive, and openly mocking. As Carla read the exchanges aloud, the courtroom fell silent, the weight of missed opportunities covering the space like a shroud. Margaret's confidence began to dip for the first time as her face tightened. The HOA's attorney attempted to rally by appealing to the jury's sense of loss and community during closing arguments, but the argument proved fruitless. In her final words, Carla reminded everyone that resiliency was not a sin, that Elijah's only fault was being thoughtful enough to prepare, and that blaming him would not help them rebuild their homes or heal their wounds. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courthouse mounting with every passing minute. Elijah sat with his hands folded, his mind racing through every moment of the past year, every accusation, every act of kindness, every sleepless night. When a verdict finally came, the judge's voice was clear and unwavering. Elijah Brooks was not liable for the damages. The case was dropped without prejudice. The courtroom erupted, with some speaking in relief, others in rage, and the majority remaining silent. Margaret sank to the floor as her backers fled, their confidence shaken. Carla hugged Elijah, her composure breaking for the first time. Reporters rushed to capture his reaction, but Elijah simply thanked the jury, the judge, and his attorney, his voice steady but his eyes shining with unshed tears. Outside the courthouse, the air felt lighter, the storm finally passing. A few of the neighbors came up to Elijah and apologized, shook his hand, and even gave him a hug, because they were unwilling or unable to let go of their resentment. Others kept their distance. Because he was aware that real healing would take time, Elijah graciously accepted everything. He returned home that evening to find a small crowd waiting. Friends, supporters, and even a few former critics, all gathered to welcome him back. He invited them in, sharing food, stories, and a quiet sense of relief. For the first time in months, Willow Bend felt like a community again, fragile but hopeful, scarred but still standing. In the weeks that followed, Willow Bend began the slow, difficult work of rebuilding, not just homes, but trust and the sense of community that had been battered by both the hurricane and the bitterness that came after. Elijah found himself at the center of this transformation, not because he sought attention, but because his resilience and quiet generosity had become a beacon for those ready to move forward. He spent his days assisting neighbors in roof repairs, clearing debris, and navigating the insurance claim maze, never turning down requests for assistance, even from those who had previously been accused of using him. Carla Jenkins, now a local hero in her own right, organized workshops on disaster preparedness, drawing on Elijah's expertise and encouraging the neighborhood to adopt the very standards he had once been mocked for. The HOA, chastened by defeat and the public scrutiny that followed, underwent a dramatic change. Margaret Whitfield resigned, replaced by a new board committed to transparency, inclusivity, and real safety. They invited Elijah to serve as an advisor, and though he hesitated at first, he accepted, determined to ensure that no one else would be scapegoated for doing the right thing. The story of Willow Bend spread far beyond the city limits, picked up by national news outlets and shared on social media as a lesson in resilience, prejudice, and the dangers of letting fear override reason. Elijah was invited to speak at conferences and community gatherings, where he always stressed the importance of preparation, compassion, and standing up for what is right, even when it means standing alone, and received letters of support from across the nation. Over time, the wounds of the past year began to heal. New houses rose where old ones had fallen, built stronger and smarter, their owners united by the memory of what they had endured and the knowledge that they had survived together. The neighborhood's annual block party, once a stilted affair, became a true celebration. With Elijah at the grill, laughter echoing down the street, and children playing in yards that had once been filled with debris. Some scars remained. There were still those who avoided Elijah's gaze, who grumbled about the changes, who clung to old resentments, but they were fewer with each passing season. The quiet moments when a neighbor knocked on his door for advice or a child asked him how to build something strong enough to withstand any storm were Elijah's greatest victories, not the lawsuit's dismissal or recognition. He was aware that while one's trust can never be completely restored after it has been damaged, it can be rebuilt one kind deed at a time. Willow Bend was prepared for the upcoming hurricane season, not only with stronger homes, but also with a stronger sense of community that was forged through hardship and tempered by the bravery of one man who refused to be broken. And as Elijah stood on his porch, watching the sun set over a neighborhood that had finally learned the true meaning of resilience, he felt a peace he had not known in a long time, a peace earned not by surviving the storm, but by helping others find their way through it.